Good evening and welcome to Democratic TV. It's a television program produced by Democrats for Democrats with a where we present our democratic values and our interest in public policy and affect some of those outcomes. The subject of our show this evening is the public policy around immigration and immigration as it relates particularly to the southern border of the U.S. and the effects that the U.S. government is having upon the lives of people from other countries who are seeking the protection of the United States government or simply trying to make a living. My guests this evening are Arlene Amarante, Arlene Amarante, a Knoxville resident and attorney who has practiced immigration law in areas near the southern border, and William Gill, also a Knoxville resident and a law professor at Lincoln Memorial Duncan School of Law, who also provides legal assistance and pro bono, I guess, to people in East Tennessee who are in need of legal guidance to ensure their rights are their constitutional rights are protected and due process is maintained, and they're dealing with our immigration and customs enforcement agents and the immigration courts that adjudicate their cases. Arlene, would you start with a brief sketch of yourself, and then when she's finished, William, just come in right behind her and tell us who you are.
Absolutely. I am the Executive Director of the Immigrant Justice Initiative, which is a community education initiative inspired by my time as a volunteer attorney at the detention centers in both Artesia, New Mexico and Dilley, Texas.
Okay. Ooh, okay. Dilley, Texas has got a ring to it that I just read something that you sent me, I think, from Dilley. It had an influence on me.
Again, my name is William Gill. Good to be here. My day job is teaching legal writing at LMU Duncan School of Law, and I also work as a volunteer with various immigration nonprofits, including Catholic Charities of East Tennessee here in Knoxville. I've recently been involved in some of the efforts to help people involved in the ICE raid in Morristown, Tennessee.
Okay. Now, have you represented some of the people who were involved in that raid or who were taken into detention in that raid, or have been dealing with the owners of the business, or who are you dealing with?
I have not been dealing with the owners of the business. I have been involved in helping the people who were working at the facility that was the subject of the raid. Was involved in helping. We set up a series of legal clinics right after the raid, so I talked to a lot of people at those clinics, and am representing a client who is now in immigration removal proceedings.
Right. Okay. Now, what specifically you're relatively new to Knoxville? What specifically does the Immigrant Justice Center?
It's the Immigrant Justice Initiative.
Yeah, initiative,
and
yes.
What we do is programs like these, speak as well in classrooms, and it's mostly an online presence to develop a dialogue around immigrants.
So you're edifying. You're teaching us a little bit about the issues.
I hope to.
All of us, yeah. Okay. Well, then that's what we're doing today.
Yes.
All right, good enough. Well, what we really want to do is really want to find out how do the people who are being impacted by this directly feel, and how are we presenting ourselves as a country and as a population to them and as individuals. But before that, let's talk a little bit about what is this immigration system, and what is their why has it become such an issue, and why is it in front of us? So I guess the first question is, what is the most common process for someone who does not live in this country, who is coming to the country either to study, to work, to live? What's the most common thing that they do? What's the process that they go through to get here?
I'm going to give you the very standard legal answer, which is it depends.
Depends.
It's a good lawyer answer.
So generally, the reasons behind an entry to the United States will need to be justified either prior to entry or, in the case of an asylum seeker, at the border. Entry at the border. So, for all of these different circumstances, if somebody wants to come here to work, they need to apply for a work visa. If they want to go to school, they need to apply for a school visa. If they want to come and be a tourist, then they need to apply to be a tourist.
Okay.
Generally speaking,
where do they go to get these visas?
So they have to go to the American consulate that is found in their countries of nationality. And at that consulate, they will be asked to sort of justify their entry to the United States, and the immigration officer is going to sort of conduct a balance between how many connections you have in the country of origin versus how many connections you might have in the United States, so as to ensure that the motivation behind the entry to the United States is the actual stated one by the intending immigrant or non-immigrant.
So if they come with a visa or they come with permission, they're vetted, essentially.
Yes, in some fashion,
Yeah,
right.
I
They need
mean, at
to
least
submit for fingerprints,
right,
and they
yeah,
need
exactly.
to.
Right.
There's a different process for different types of immigration benefits, but one of the things we see is that there is a pretty thorough vetting process that's been in place for some time. And the only thing I would add is just that, you know, the most statistically speaking, the greatest numbers of folks who are coming here with visas are coming through an employment process or through a family-based petition. And one misconception that we see a lot is that you can just sort of put your name in line, which is not true. If you don't have an employer here or a family member here who's qualified to sponsor you, there's no line to get in.
Right, exactly. That's what I understand.
So to go just a little bit deeper, if I may, this is traditionally where most immigrants sort of like get in line, or at least metaphorically speaking, this is where they get in line. This is because this is where they sign up to actually be intending immigrants, whereas the other categories that we mentioned necessarily might not have that permanence to them, such as a family-based visa would. Now, the issue with family-based visas is that they are limited by region, and they're also numerically limited, so that where you're from will greatly impact how long it will take for you to enter the country, and also the closeness of your tie to whoever is petitioning for you to enter. So, for instance, let's say that I'm a U.S. citizen, and I would like to petition for my sister. I am from Mexico. The wait.
This is the worst category in the world.
Mexico, Philippines is another not so great category to be in. But what this means is that my sister would need to wait upwards of 23 years for that visa, and understandably, she might not be so inclined to wait that period outside of the country.
There are another now. It really has to be initiated by the person who's coming in. How about for the most part? On the other hand, there are ways to get in. What if you're a contractor and you need a couple guys in your roofing crew? What can you do there?
There are, I mean, without getting into too much detail, there are various employment categories.
I mean, can you go out and reach out and say, I need this guy in here to hammer nails on my roof?
It's a pretty long process. And so there are different visas, some of which are designed to bring folks here temporarily for agricultural or non-agricultural work. There are other categories for so-called skilled workers, and different visas and different categories that are available for people depending upon the nature of the work and the permanence of their stay here.
The point that we should leave with is that it's tough to get that into that process.
Yes.
I mean, that's not just something that you ignore. It's just something you have to ignore if you're going to get here.
There are laws whose express purpose is to protect American workers' rights to have priority for those jobs.
Right. But I've just read articles from people who are, in a sense, desperate. They need people. They don't really care where they come from or who they are, but they need people, and we don't have enough people with the skills that they're looking for here. So there's a tremendous, my point there is there's tremendous pressure both to get here and to be drawn here.
Yes, and this is of course confounded by the problem that when you are looking for, let's say in the realm of construction, if you want to have a building built, this is the kind of job that an American citizen can do in theory, right? So it will be,
there were some of them.
But it will be really difficult for an employer to hire somebody from outside of the country, because in theory somebody within the country should be able to fulfill that position.
That's how those laws work that protect the
so you have to be, in other words, to get the job you got to be here.
So, no, you need to be, particularly for work-based visas, it needs to be highly skilled. It needs to be the kind of thing that you can't find.
Right. But the contractor who needs the worker doesn't care about that. What he needs somebody to drive those nails. He needs somebody to put the shingles down. He needs somebody to hang the drywall. He needs somebody to do those kinds of tasks now. And
the way that our laws function, there is no mechanism for them to.
So there's just a disconnect between the market, what the market wants, and what our laws are willing to permit.
And the market is pretty strong. The market
Yes.
forces are pretty strong. That's kind of what I want to leave with it. And can I say from what you said that legal is going through the process of the visa or the permission to get in advance of coming in, and then illegal is either that you've overstayed that permission period or you've come in through some other route.
Yes, the term we usually use is enter without inspection.
Yeah, okay. Which means you walked across the bridge and they didn't see you, or you.
Well, if you walked across the bridge, you would probably be there.
Yeah. Or you came in the back of a semi-trailer.
And for whatever reason, you were just not inspected at the border.
Or for some reason you came through. Okay. So there's a classification there. We talk about illegal or not documented. That's a really kind of a fuzzy term in a sense. I mean, what is it? But essentially it's someone who doesn't have the visa that's current at the moment.
That's right, and it is good to think about. You know, when we meet our clients, we will talk to them about whether they entered without inspection or overstayed their visa if they're undocumented, and there's legal ramifications to those classifications.
Okay, the two of you both had some experiences with real people who are impacted by ICE and by the CPB and by the court systems. Arlene, what are some of your experiences when that you've had in your career?
I began my career representing victims of domestic violence, and when I started, it was representing victims within the country, so that they were either married to a U.S. citizen or someone without documentation, but nonetheless there are certain legal protections for domestic victims of domestic violence.
Okay.
But more recently I've started working almost exclusively with asylum applicants, and as you can imagine, when you're applying for asylum, you are seeking protection for something that happened outside of our borders. And that is becoming an increasingly complex problem. And this is due primarily in part to where our asylum laws come from, and that is in the aftermath of World War II, we developed a legal definition for a refugee that is no longer reflective of our geopolitical situations around the world.
No, they don't reflect us, and they don't reflect the situation that people are in around the world, both. Is that correct?
Well, that is correct. And if I may just briefly tell you what that definition requires, it must require some kind of government acquiescence. And there must be persecution for the right reasons. And so this is when I say that our policies are no longer reflective of our current society. I mean that the only reason that we have a protection for somebody in the past, and existing today, can be for political reasons, religious reasons, membership in a particular social group, which is a sort of catch-all, and place of origin. So those reasons that we've crafted are no longer necessarily the reasons being cited by a vast majority of people fleeing for their lives.
Does that come out of our experience in World War II?
Our definition comes from
out
our
of that experience, right? Exactly.
So
you worked with people who are coming to this country for essentially protection.
Correct.
And they're not getting it where they're coming from, but they're hopeful that they can achieve it here. We want to talk about that in a few minutes.
Yes, I would love to expand on that.
Yeah. What is your experience at Morristown?
So
what happened to the people who got caught up in that raid?
First of all, this was in April of this year, and it took everyone by surprise because this workplace raid, this method of enforcement, was something that we saw during the Bush presidency, and then it disappeared during the Obama administration. And this Morristown raid was the biggest raid in the country in a decade.
Oh, wow.
And so it really took the community by surprise. And you know, I showed up there the day of the raid. We were set up in the gymnasium of a school.
Were you warned in advance?
No, certainly not.
Okay,
certainly
so in other words,
not.
the raid occurred. You wind up.
ICE does not make a practice of calling us immigration attorneys ahead of time and letting us know about their SWAT team like.
So you wind up in a gymnasium. What time of the day?
So the raid occurred in the morning about 9 o'clock. One of my students, who's very connected with the immigrant community, actually told me about it first. And you know, I sort of envisioned 5 to 10 folks being involved, but it ended up being closer to 100.
Oh, wow.
I think it was 97 was the final count. And so I didn't get there until that evening. I came from Knoxville. I was at a gala, actually.
Oh, you
and I was dressed.
Dressed
I was not dressed for my
immigration
clinic, and I showed up, and there was a few of us showed up, and it was really like a trauma scene. I mean, it was almost impossible to practice law in that environment. People were just confused, angry. It was traumatic.
And people who had been caught in the raid, some were detained and put in prison or put in jail at least.
Correct.
I mean, so it was a chaotic event for each family.
Certainly. And so what happened is they went into this facility, and this was a slaughterhouse called Southeastern Provisions, beef slaughterhouse, and they went in and they took in everybody who they thought were working without authorization. Some turned out to be working with authorization.
Okay, right, yeah.
But they were all taken to a local facility and fingerprinted and so forth. And then some people were released because there was no basis to hold them.
They had papers. Yeah.
Others were given a notice to appear in immigration court and released on their own recognizance. And others were detained and taken away the next morning to a facility in Louisiana, which is where folks are filtered from this region.
I want to get back to that in a minute. Arlene, can you give us a little, just a vignette or a little anecdote about one of your clients who was coming, what happened to that client who came to this country looking for protection from, let's just say, domestic violence?
I would actually, so I have a vignette, but not of a particular client. But I think
you could, a composite.
Yes.
That'd be fine.
My first interaction with the world of detention happened in the summer of 2014, when we were seeing a large influx of Central Americans fleeing their countries and seeking protection here. I arrived at the facility in Artesia armed with legal knowledge, and I was prepared to take down declarations and find answers.
You're going to be a good lawyer.
I wanted to do my job. I was there for legal reasons, but I wasn't prepared for the humanitarian side. The violations of their human rights are rampant, and it seems to be standard operating procedures. You would have the officers call the women animals to their faces. They would deny the women and children drinks.
You mean like water?
Water.
Yeah.
To the extent that when I arrived, I quickly realized that most of the children had lips that were so chapped that they were bleeding.
Dry. Oh, wow.
We smuggled in fruits because our hearts were broken.
You carry them in your purse, or I mean, how did you get them in?
I had it. So one of the privileges of being an attorney is that you have a briefcase.
There aren't many perks, but
and you just for the most part can get woven or just sort of waved in, just by the guards, and that's exactly what happened. And so I had a contraband consisting of juice boxes and toys, crayons, and oranges, all of which were confiscated. And it's just the most...
Confiscated when they were given to those who were detained?
So we tried to be furtive about our smuggling practices, but the fact that we had to smuggle food into a government facility in the first place,
a U.S. government facility.
A U.S. government facility, it's just heartbreaking. And
you didn't learn that in law school.
No, I didn't learn how to deal with that in law school, and nor did I learn that apparently if your child has a fever, you just need to give them some extra dose of juice. And so we're talking about standards of care that fall well below any that I think our government.
And you would say that would be somewhat normal. In other words, that low standard of care was everyday practice.
It was everyday practice.
Not because you were there, not to impress you, but it was just that's the way they did it. Well, I read some of those stories, and I would call those I guess those are ICE people. They're like the capos I read about in Treblinka, and I mean, they just didn't see their in a sense, the people in their facilities as human beings.
So it's troubling because they seem to have lost their sense of humanity.
Yeah, that's what I read in that.
To the extent that they called into question every single story that they heard. They sort of assumed that the women were lying about their motives for being in the country.
Right.
In fact, there was such a huge influx as of 2014 that the Trump administration has now gone on to claim that our asylum procedures are far too lenient. And one of the biggest problems that we're seeing now is that the Department of Justice has actually gone back to limit the already restrictive protections.
In a sense, making it possible for the treatment that people are getting in those facilities to continue, because they're illegal, they're wrong, they're criminal.
Right.
Yeah.
One other thing that I want to share is that we heard repeatedly the same stories that the immigration officers would yell at the women and tell them the judge is going to get so mad at you if you ask for a lawyer, because then you're just wasting time. And even this, we decided to craft Know Your Rights cards to let the
disinformation.
women, yes, we wanted to let the women know that they were entitled to speak with an attorney, and in fact, we were there to provide our services on a pro bono basis.
And
so
that is a legal right.
That is a legal right.
I mean, that's not something you're contriving. That's something that they had the right they had.
That's correct.
You have a right to speak with an attorney and to hire an attorney for your proceeding. Absolutely.
That's a condition of being on our soil.
That is a fundamental due process right that you have. Your hearing is
that you get
a fair hearing requires that you have access to. Now you will not have a lawyer provided to you like in our criminal justice system. So that's an important distinction. Right. But you have the right to consult with counsel and to hire counsel. Counsel.
What is do you have a story of someone, a particularly poignant story of someone in the Morristown raid that who's been affected dramatically by that raid?
Certainly,
somewhat unfairly.
And again, just for a composite, I mean, if I were to take one lesson that I've seen from this raid, it's that we have no discernible priorities in our immigration policy, and when you use the sort of sledgehammer of the mass raid as a method of enforcement, here's who you end up clogging the system with. Folks who have been here for 10, 15, 20, 25 years, who have no criminal record to speak of, who are hardworking, who pay taxes, who are family people, who have children who are primarily U.S. citizens because they were born here. And those are the people who you are putting into the system, and the system, it exacts a cost on the system.
Sure.
It costs all of us time and energy to deal with those cases, meaning that you cannot go after, you cannot direct your enforcement toward the people who should be a priority.
Right. I know in the Obama administration they deported an awful lot of people, but they claim at least that they were deporting people who had criminal records or who had a reason for being deported, not just the fact that they were here.
At least on paper, the policy of felons, not families, gives you a sense. Now we can argue about whether they successfully
could do that or
executed that policy.
Well,
now what we have is it's not even the semblance of a policy.
Yeah.
It's just going after everyone all the time. And when you use the raid as a method, or when you just, without any zero tolerance at the border, you're going to end up catching a lot of people, spending a lot of time and energy and resources on really the best of the immigration. Do
you have any, for example, the people who were deported, not deported, but who were sent to Arizona for detention, were some of them long-term employees at that facility or long-term residents of Morristown, or were they all those who were sent back to Arizona, people who had arrived recently?
Almost everyone in the Morristown raid was a long-standing member of the community.
Okay,
that was the typical case of someone who had been here 5, 10, 15
So it startled the community as well. The community wasn't prepared for that either.
It was incredible, and there's been a lot written about this, so I encourage everyone to look at the articles, both in the local papers and in the national papers, about how there was a lot of community involvement in helping out. It was not, the legal help. We were really a small part of it. You saw this tremendous effort from folks in the community to help their neighbors.
What'll be the net result? How many people who were ensnared in that raid will wind up being sent back to the country of origin?
Well, about 10 of the folks already had a deportation order in their past.
Okay.
And so they were referred for criminal prosecution in federal court for illegal reentry. So that's one segment of folks that were sent to the criminal process. Most of the rest of them, if they were not working with authorization, if they were undocumented, are going to be in removal proceedings. And so there's been a big effort that has really been led by the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, TIRC, to provide representation for these folks. And there is a benefit. Again, we won't get too technical. There is a benefit for folks who have been here a long time and who have shown themselves to be persons of good moral character.
But if there's no sense of priorities, do they get consideration or not?
They get their day in immigration court,
okay.
but it's a real struggle to find them representation because we don't have enough immigration lawyers to take those cases, and there's a cap on the number of
as we're talking about this, it strikes me as that, just a few days ago, maybe going on right now, people from South Korea are being able to go back into North Korea to reunite with their families. Are we going to wind up with families who are separated by our border just as effectively as the North Koreans were separated?
And not just by our border, but here in East Tennessee. The raid has the effect of separating families in our region.
But I mean, that's essentially what was going on in North Korea and South Korea, is that North Korea said, you can't come and see us. And essentially, we're doing the same thing to families who wound up on the wrong side of the border at the wrong time.
And have no mechanism for entering on a legal basis.
Exactly,
and the use of family separation is a deterrent effect. I mean, that kind of speaks for itself.
Well, this discussion has been long.
Yes.
And we have a lot more to talk about, but I wanted to, just before we end, what's the status of DACA, and is there any hope for that being fixed, do you think?
So as of today, the applications are still being accepted by USCIS, but there's
do they process them
for renewal?
For renewal.
Okay. In other words, if you didn't apply the first time, you don't have an opportunity to apply now.
There's actually some mixed messaging as to whether you can have first-time applicants. I think it's sort of
it's changing by the day. But
I
think if you look at the USCIS webpage right now, they'll say you can't.
That you cannot submit
for a first time, but you can renew.
Okay. Okay.
There's some confusion on this point.
Now, what I understand is that there were people who were eligible for DACA, but may have been a bit skeptical or may not have known specifically what they needed to do, so they missed some deadlines. Could they reapply or no? They can't reapply because they never did. I guess that's the thing. So
right.
It wouldn't be a renewal.
They're caught in that problem.
There is some guidance that is missing in just this area.
Yeah. Okay. So just in summary, we've got a system that is clogged in terms of coming into the country legally. Once you're here, it's clogged to figure out what my status should be, and then if and there's, as you say, no priority, so people are just being willy-nilly chased away.
So just very quickly, I think the most important takeaway is that by getting rid of our priorities, we are essentially saying that everybody is a priority, and this has stripped judges of their long-standing discretion to close cases that don't benefit anybody.
They could have closed the case.
That has been a mechanism that has been traditionally used up until the Trump administration.
And on DACA, the answer is the DREAM Act legislation, but we can't get there.
All right, well, that concludes the discussion today. We hope you come back and listen to us. We'll be back on the air next Friday night, 7:30. Hope to see you there.